Well, joining me today to look through all those are the columnist at The Times, Melanie Phillips, and the editor-at-large of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, is there too. Now, Melanie, I have to say, I didn't think this was exactly a vintage collection of columns, but, you know, it seems to me everyone's still arguing about what to do about coronavirus, but no one really has a clear idea.
Well, I think that's obviously true, that people are arguing and that there is no clear idea. I think there are many ideas jostling for primacy. And I think the problem has been that the government itself hasn't been clear. I think that Boris Johnson has been caught between his desire simultaneously to avoid the maximum economic damage and to avoid the maximum damage to human life. And as a result, he's sort of tried to chart a course down the middle of the road. And as we all know, if you walk down the middle of the road, you tend to get run over from both sides. Personally, I think that this sounds very hard, but I think that experience across the world shows that regional lockdowns, trying to localize the problem where it's flaring up most and trying to deal with it there rather than dealing with the whole country, sounds very attractive because it gets away from the terrible economic damage of a full lockdown, but it doesn't work because the virus bleeds in willy-nilly, and eventually experience from other countries shows that a broader lockdown becomes necessary, and then it becomes even worse in terms of its consequences.
And Ian, Martin Kettle making the point that if you try and implement this on a regional basis, those areas which are affected tend to get quite angry about it.
Yeah, it's a good piece, this, actually. And his point is almost sort of broader than that. It's essentially to say, look, I mean, Boris Johnson managed to get these votes, something the Tory party has been trying to do for a long time, trying to say, look, here are voters in the north who, on cultural issues, signed up to the Conservative agenda. However, what's interesting about that, as Martin Kettle points out, is that it wasn't as if it was this broad proposal that Boris Johnson made at the election. It was quite a divisive, tribal, cultural proposition that he put forward on Brexit. Now that the Brexit issue is not the one that's animating the headlines this week, as we start seeing with the logistics of public health, the logistics of the economy, that tough tribal approach has stayed, but the coalition that he built is starting to splinter. So the piece sort of ends up arguing that actually the fundamental approach of Johnson, this idea that you don't try and maintain this broad electoral coalition, you just really deliver for this cultural tribal base, is now starting to fracture when you get a very, very different set of circumstances emerge.
What do you think, Melanie? Do you think that turning the red wall blue is now a thing of the past?
Not necessarily. I'm sure, obviously, electoral considerations play a part in what Boris Johnson is doing. But I think that also he believes that he will be judged by whether or not he actually brings this pandemic under control with minimal damage. And I think that's what's driving him crazy, quite honestly, because it's these dictates that are pulling him in completely the opposite direction. As far as the red wall is concerned, they will judge him harshly on the basis of COVID. They will also judge him harshly on the basis of where we end up, where Britain ends up over Brexit, over its negotiations with the EU. I think it's not a straightforward thing, but this idea that, you know, that Boris is being driven by utterly venal considerations. Obviously, he is to a certain extent. He's a politician. They all are. But I also think, looking at him, I think he is absolutely bowed down by the terrible weight of this thing he's having to grapple with, and you look at, you know, other countries in the world, no one's doing a really fantastic job. No one's actually managed to say, look, we've cracked it, you haven't. Everyone's struggling through. Now, I think there are very legitimate reasons to criticize Boris Johnson's policy from the start, but I think some of the criticism is a little bit unfair. I think there is too much still of a tendency to view what politicians like him are doing simply through the very narrow lens of the belief that, well, they're all venal and they're all dishonest and they're all out just to win the next election. That's obviously part of it, but I think that it's a bit superficial.
Now, the man Boris Johnson beat to become Tory leader last year is the former Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. What do you make, Ian, of his push in the Daily Mail saying, well, look, we're having to spend money now. Why don't we just effectively, bite the bullet on this very complicated issue of care and spend more money on sorting that out?
Yeah, I mean, he's doing the best that he can in order to say, look, you've got a levelling up agenda. You want to have something to go with your legacy. You want to have accomplishments that are outside of Brexit or simple management of coronavirus. And here's the thing that you can do. It will cost an awful lot of money, but you said that you were going to do it. There is pent-up demand to do it, and governments of various political hues have failed to do it for some time. The problem that he finds is the problem that anyone finds, and that Boris Johnson himself is finding with all the other spending promises and investments that he wanted to make, which is that coronavirus will suffocate you as a government. There is no space. There is certainly no space for more spending, for more attention, for more sort of logistical support than there is just simply dealing with coronavirus. That's why, in a few minutes, we're going to have Rishi Sunak standing up in the Commons announcing new measures. That's why we're getting a 1-year sort of spending review rather than a 3-year plan. It's because at the moment we're in the furnace of this grotesque chaos, and nothing that a government does can really start planning these major sort of operations when it's trying to deal day to day with this enormous emergency.
Now, Kate Maltby writes about Samuel Paty, the French teacher in France who was beheaded after showing some of his pupils cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Do you think the response, Melanie, of the rest of the world, particularly in the UK, has been too muted, as Kate Maltby suggests?
I think what Kate Maltby says is absolutely correct. I think the response in the UK has been muted. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the UK it certainly has been muted. And I think this is all of a piece with the way in which in Britain the media has been responding to Islamist supremacism and terrorism. Really, ever since, I would say, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie when the Iranian regime came to power. Because that was when, we had his book being burned in the streets. That was when we had the first threat of murder against somebody for mocking Islam. And the response of the UK was very, very muted to that. And from that moment, the media understood that if you were to be deemed to have offended against Islam, you would die, or your newspaper would be burned to the ground. And the media has been responding ever since in that way. And, the media, in my view, for the last N decades has been censoring itself over Islamic and Islamist supremacism, jihadism, terrorism, and all the rest of it. So when you come to the murder of the beheading of this guy, this poor unfortunate guy, it didn't actually pass without comment, but the comment was very muted.
It's not just the media, though, is it? It's a very different tone being struck by the political leaderships of France and the UK, that there was a national memorial service for Paty. The president went out of his way to say, we will continue the work you're doing. We do tend to get in a far more qualified response to Islamicist violence in this country, don't we?
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I'm sort of a bit baffled by what was just said. I mean, my memory of the years pretty much from sort of September the 11th up to really just before Brexit, where our whole debate sort of swung in another direction, arguably with the exception of financial crisis, was that we talked about Islamic terrorism an awful lot. And there was an awful lot of chatter about this sort of nonsense view that sort of Muslim cultures were incompatible with Western cultures and things like that. I mean, the truth is, most territory, I mean, you look at the attack on the Bataclan, which was, just a few years ago, and there was very, very extensive coverage of that attack. I think what happened in this case was it it came out at a moment when the news agenda is extremely thick in this country with events. I mean, you're looking at the Brexit talks, you're looking at coronavirus. I mean, these are very, very major events. And I think it just kind of got sort of shuffled off to the side a little bit. And I think the reason that it wasn't talked about that much in the UK was as banal and as sort of pedestrian as that, really.
Thank you both very much indeed.